morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. So I'm pretty excited to have this panel discussion with the wonderful line of speakers we have had here today. The discussion is going to be the retrieval-augmented generations, again, one of the favorite topics that resonates with artificial intelligence. So just maybe a quick and brief introduction about myself. I'm Parul Khanna, Director of Cybersecurity at Cineplex. And why don't we start with an introduction about yourself, Priya, from there?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Parul. Yeah, happy to be here. I'm Priya Mauli. I'm the Head of Information Security and Compliance at Sheridan College. Sheridan College is a premier post-secondary institution here in Canada. We're known for our flagship program of animation, arts, and design. As for myself, I have about 20 years of experience in the cybersecurity space, so covering cybersecurity, privacy, regulatory compliance, data governance, and we cannot miss AI governance. So I guess our roles just keep expanding.
Perfect.
Happy to be here.
Yes.
Over to you, Hashim.
Thanks, Priya. Hashim.
Thanks, Priya. My name is Hashim Singh. I'm with Netscope. I've been in cybersecurity for almost 10 plus years. I focus on zero trust architectures, data security, and cloud. I look forward to having this conversation on this panel. Carlos.
I'm Carlos Aquilele, Sales Engineering Manager at CrowdStrike. And my goal is always to, support customers, make sure we understand what your security outcomes are, and make sure we help you achieve it. The goal is always to stop breaches. But now we want to understand how we do that with AI as well.
I'm Ivo Wiens. I'm the Field CTO for Cybersecurity at CDW Canada. CDW known for its being able to bring technology to people, but we do also have a cybersecurity brand. So my goal, speaking of goals, is specifically to help the cybersecurity brand, and CDW being raised as a cybersecurity brand. We have a fantastic cybersecurity practice, and I'm the Field CTO that leads this practice. And I'm here to not only talk a little bit about AI, but also learn from these fantastic folks.
Yeah, that's excellent. And thank you for the great introductions. So we'll be talking about the retrieval-augmented generation. Again, like what are some of the best practices? How exactly do we go about implementing that? So I'm definitely interested to know from this fantastic line of speakers that we have. Let's first, for the sake of the audience here, let's first try to break down this term, the retrieval-augmented generation, within the realms of large language models. So I'll start with you, Ivo. What are your thoughts around the retrieval-augmented generation, like some of the use cases pertaining to it's used within the industries today?
Yeah, we're seeing a range. And one actually where we've just finished our security survey every year. We actually surveyed 800 Canadian organizations together with IDC, and we've been asking ML AI questions now almost for 6 years. So even before AI was cool, we were already doing it. So we've been asking questions about that. And one interesting finding that this year, it's not even actually the report's not even out yet. So this is a bit of a preview. Is that only 28% of organizations only 28% of AI projects get past the POC stage. So we're seeing hesitancy. And the follow-up question was why? And the answer was, security and compliance are the reasons we're not making the move yet. We're worried about privacy, we're worried about compliance. So there's been a lot of hesitation in that space. So that's what we're seeing in the space. But when we talk specifically about, I think we'll touch on the specific threats and the risks that come along with it. When we talk to organizations and when we talk about AI, I always like to think, sort of two balancing factors. One of them being how high are the stakes and how reversible is it what you're doing, right? So if you're talking about high stakes, a use case that could have high stakes and low reversibility could be mission critical diagnostic imaging using AI for that. Not only is it life or death from a stakes perspective, but also really hard to untrain people, let's see, administrators, nurses, doctors on using the system. So that's an example of that. But then there's other examples on the other side, right? Using it to write marketing copy. Right? Marketing copy can be reviewed and you can undo really easily. And if the marketing copy is not right, you disconnect it. Just don't have that marketing copy being connected directly to your social media and start posting out there, right? So I think the automation and those two pieces when it comes to stakes versus reversibility, it seems to resonate with folks when they're making that decision in the beginning. And you don't want to do something that's not reversible either. So we're hearing that from clients specifically.
Right. Carlos, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm going to kind of try to simplify that, right? And what I mean simplify, if you think about, the architecture, right, from AI, large language model perspective, and then you say, well, what does RAG and where does RAG fit in that architecture? Just let's simplify it down to three things, right? The front end, UI, the application that sits in the middle, and then the data stores could be the data that the model has been built on, or it could be business data that you use to ground the model. Because if you're getting, let's say, a publicly available model from Copilot, et cetera, you're not going to ground that data with public data. You're going to ground that with business data. So there's the data, right? And that data is RAG, Retrieval-Augmented Generation. So if you think about that, that doesn't change. That has been how we've built application, front end, and we'll talk about the weaknesses there, the application, and then the data that supports the application. And RAG is really your data, your business data that grounds the live language model in terms of the responses and the output. So that's the high-level overview from simplified perspective. And then the goal is, what are the challenges we face from a security perspective across those three quote-unquote domains?
Yeah, I think you kind of like hit right on the spot there. So when we talk about like retrieval augmented generation, definitely we are looking at like some of the real-time data or the organization data as compared to like something like ChatGPT, which uses like pre-trained model, right? Your large language model. So like if you're looking into some of the use cases, so I would like to take your thoughts, Hashim, like what are some of the possible use cases of your retrieval augmented generation there?
Yeah, so when we look at like RAG architectures, what you're trying to, I think I'll build on you one, Carlos, here is, there is a conversation to be had around governance compliance, because at the end of the day, any RAG architecture, you're actually putting your data in. So from the far back, when I look at it from a data protection perspective, from our technology perspective, what we were trying to say is put the right data in. So it's learning the right data. So if you input the right data and it's secure data, your output's going to look good, because once it's inside the architecture and the LLM has learned it, it's there. So the conversations we're having is like, make sure you have the right data, right governance into it. So if you're GDPR compliant, let's just make sure the type of data you're putting in and that the output the user is going to see is in compliance, right? So we look at, there's different kinds of RAG architectures, but from a simple perspective, that's where we are trying to kind of drive our customers to understand that whatever you put in, just make sure it's good. Priya?
Thanks, Hashim. So I was going to say, so in terms of RAG, I mean, exactly, I'm aligned with everything that was spoken about here, but then some of the use cases specific to academic institutions and what we are dealing with is that one of the challenges, I will say, in terms of, large language models outputs is, it may not always be accurate, right? May not always be unbiased outputs. So the bias aspect is kind of, what we focus on as an academic institution. And I'm part of the AI steering committee where we're doing exactly that. So I'll probably talk about two use cases that we're looking at. One is around, there is AI detection tools out there in terms of being able to see as to whether students use AI for their assessments and their assignments, right? Now there is news out there, skepticism around how accurate these tools are. And actually, very recently, what happened was that so there was a case in in Stanford University where a student got wrongly flagged by an AI detection tool in terms of using these tools for her assessment, but when she indeed did not use it. And the reason for one of that was the data it was trained on, right? So like, for example, this person was neurodivergent, so had a very formulaic, different way of representing their thoughts and ideas. And no, the AI detection tool did not catch that, because LLMs are trained on the same data sets. AI detection tools are trained on the same data sets. As a result of which, it is very important to curate these data sets and make sure that you're considering not only, the data from the bell curve, but you consider those outliers as well. So that's, one of our use cases as a result of which, the RAG architecture definitely becomes prominent. And just in terms of, deep diving on some of the benefits of the RAG architecture is that outside of the unbiased outputs, outside of the context-rich outputs, there is also additional benefits based on, it's more cost-effective, because I think exactly as Carlos mentioned, once there is a user query, it is augmented with with more credible knowledge sources, and then it provides more context-rich responses. So as a result of which, the output of the LLMs are more current, more relevant, more unbiased. And also it is cost effective because it's pointing to information sources as opposed to having your LLMs retrain on brand new data, which is definitely cost effective and time consuming as well. The other benefit I'll highlight is that it also allows for more control for developers, right? Like, for example, you can point to, if you see your information sources are not accurate or need editing to reflect to the most up-to-date sources, developers can easily, developers with the right access. I know we're going to touch on security and privacy later, but then, developers can absolutely dynamically point to these information sources.
That's great. Yeah, great insights. So talking about the security and privacy considerations with respect to the implementations of the retrieval-augmented generation, this is definitely one of the things which is on top priority for most of the companies right there. Because again, as soon as the data is being fed into your, training models, how exactly the data goes through several iterations within the embedded vectors and where exactly it finally gets stored, how the retrieval is actually grabbing that data, what kind of queries are enforced to grab that data, if there's any kind of manipulation that could be done, etc. So I'm definitely interested to hear thoughts from the panel about what are some of the security risks pertaining to the implementations of the RAG architecture. So we'll start here with you, Ivo.
Sure. I think as we always have in the cybersecurity profession, we overemphasize the real complicated stuff because it's more interesting and it's more fun to find. But when we think of the architecture and we think of that front end and that back end, we know how to protect it really well. We know how to do, we should by now figure out how to do DLP, maybe not, but doing e-discovery and setting up everything in the back end. And when it comes to the front end, be it a web application that everybody has access to, or be it an automated VM, we know how to protect those things. So the back end, it's just the magic in the middle that we're concerned about, and that's, I think, where we end up focusing a lot on. So I think there's a real balance that we need to figure out when we're protecting these pieces, to say, we know how to protect things. We know how to protect traffic on the network. We know how to protect traffic between these pieces. It's sort of magic middleware that we're worried about. And that's where we end up focusing, right? We look at gradient attacks or cross-prompt injections, all those amazing things that we can do. I love there's a red team, Microsoft Red Team exercise that's really interesting called Pirate, and they have fantastic things that you can do within it. But I think I'd like to make a vote specifically towards let's look at the way that attackers are actually going to break into your systems, and it's going to be the cheapest and easiest way first, right? Rather than spending hours trying to do cross-prompt injections or gradient attacks against the model. Let's make sure we have everything tied up around it, just like we usually do in cybersecurity, and then we can have the confidence to go into that the more red team exercise into your RAG architecture within your system.
That's right. Yeah, Carlos, any thoughts around the data poisoning aspect pertaining to your RAG architecture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Ivo kind of hit the nail on the head there. I'm going to kind of steal a little bit of the direction he's taking, because that's the same. We're very much aligned there. If you think about how security is always multi-layered, right? It's not a single layer. There are multiple layers, and you talked about the different layers. So red teaming, AI red teaming is important, right? That's proactive. You're going to search and hunt for, and you have multiple ways that it can be successful. But then you also think of at the application layer, the key concept is control what goes in and control what goes out, right? So if you think of prompt injection as an example, we've solved for that problem because we figure out how to solve SQL query injection. So if we can solve for that, then we know that we can solve for prompt injection challenges. But then there's also data poisoning in the RAG architecture and the RAG data store. I don't want to use the word database. Well, how do I protect against data poisoning? But it's no different from how CrowdStrike will help you protect against your data store in the cloud, etc. Right? There's access, activity, rules-based access control, etc. Right? But also monitoring as well. Right? Monitoring the data, who's touching, who's tampering it. But the typical approaches we see with adversaries is injection, prompt injection, but also data poisoning, right? If I can push a document into your RAG data store that allows a particular type of response data out that is, has been poisoned, then I have control, right? So those are the areas I would say we need to figure out and think through. But the good news is the blueprint's already there. We've already solved these problems in terms of how do you stop, the prompt injections, right? I've seen scenarios where you have actually multiple layers of front-end AI, an LLM, to support the other LLM to say, what does malicious prompts look like? Let's get a second AI model that looks at the prompts and says, that's malicious. That prompt, is trying to do something that is not what a standard user would do, and then say, well, we shouldn't respond to this, this prompt. That's an example I've seen some customers do. But from the back end, you talked about DLP, spot on, right? If you know about it, then the AI model knows about it. If data stores in your RAG architecture, in your RAG data store, if there's data there, then be ready for that data to get out.
Yeah, exfiltration.
Right? So the goal then is to, how do I control that data? How do I make sure that sensitive data is not being pulled into my RAG data store? How do I make sure it's being controlled of who has access to it and the activities around that and user entity behavior and suspicious access? Right? So again, these are things we've all solved for. These are things that CDW can consult for, CrowdStrike can help you, Netscope teams can help you with as well. But it's just moving those concepts onto, the AI live language model architecture.
Great. Yeah. Hashim, your thoughts around the security considerations?
Sounds like everything's
RAG?
covered. No, sure. Just at a high level, I like the way I look at it, or when we talk to a customer and you're looking at RAG architectures or any LLMs or Gen AI, I think a couple of things we have to understand is there's identity of the user, who's using it, who has access to it, and then also we have insider threat concerns generally, because if somebody's bad and malicious internally, they can put the wrong data set in, and there goes that side of the business, right? So we look at it from an identity perspective, and then you kind of break it down to controls and say, okay, where's the data being stored? Do we have SSPM kind of tied in on the back end? So we're making the data where it's housed, it's secured. Then we go into DLP control. So is it shadow data exfiltration, data, all of that, what's going in and out? So we kind of need to understand that. Then we talk about like shadow AI now. We don't say shadow IT anymore. We say shadow AI because it's understanding who's using AI, what kind of tools they're using, and then what kind of LLM models are inside the environment that people are moving the data to. So we look at it from a multi-layered approach. And then when we look at it from a defense in depth approach, which I like generally talking about is like prompt injections, is with CrowdStrike and Netscope, for example, you'd have a backend API or an IOC at least. So then that way, if there is a bad malicious link that's injected in there and they click on the link and Netscope's there, if we catch it, at least me and you are kind of covering that. So I think customers have a really good story to understand how they're looking at their approach to AI and cyber defense together with data in mind, right? So now we are solving for visibility, we're solving for threat, we're solving for data, and now we're solving for access. So if you have those combinations, I think at least you're in a better state. That's the way I kind of see it. Priya, what's your thoughts?
Yeah. So anyway, you all already covered what I had. So
Summarize.
So I was going to say, I was going to say again, like I agree with absolutely defense in depth, layered security. It's been around. We can absolutely use like the OWASP top 10. Like we can use SQL injection. We can absolutely apply the same controls. The two other points I will emphasize is that security by design, right? So the shift left security and absolutely having a human in the loop, like especially like when you're dealing with brand new things that you don't know how to deal with, right? Absolutely, make sure you're involving humans in the loop as well, especially, when you're talking about LLMs and looking at LLM queries to assist with decisioning, right? While you can use them to accelerate and expedite, you always want to have a human in the loop. So that's that. Besides the prompt, besides how you cover for prompt injection, like input validation, sanitization, output filtering, the two other things I'll emphasize are data encryption, right? I know we were talking about data security, but then data masking and encryption both at rest and in transit. We were just talking about the RAG architecture, right? It points to different data sources. There is a retriever module, there is a generator module. So you want to make sure that the data in transit as well is secured. The data at rest, meaning in the knowledge sources, are secured as well. And access control is absolutely tight, right? Principle of least privilege. Principle of least privilege absolutely for identities and users, but also in terms of apps. In terms of, do the LLMs need to really connect to so many apps, right? So that is another point I will say. And the additional thought I had was around model fine-tuning, meaning, auditing and monitoring. Again, like this is not anything new that I'm saying, like for any security practitioner, but then really, making sure that you're looking through the outputs of the LLM and then fine-tuning it, right? Like seeing if it's absolutely wrong, like for example, through a data poisoning attack, and you're absolutely, staying on top of it and making sure you're fine-tuning your model. It's never one and done.
Yeah, those are some like great insights. And personally, I mean, I really thought that there would be some like less risks with RAG, but looking at the panel discussion here, like it looks like the list can go on and on and on in terms of the security risks. So talking about like some of the best practices, right, in terms of the mitigating controls or like safeguarding our like RAG architecture, what are your thoughts around what exactly could be, some of the best practices we need to adopt within the organizations as enterprises, be it in the form of like, it could be as simple as having a policy in place which dictates like how the use of AI should be within the organization. So what are some of the trends or the best practices we are seeing out there? And I would like to start, I would like to give the mic to Priya.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Parul. I guess, so as part of the AI, the steering committee that I'm part of, so we actually, Sheridan College, so we have come up with a draft AI framework in terms of really talking about guardrails and acceptable use. And, just given the nature of the institution, we have it actually across 3 pillars. So one is for teaching and learning, so academia, so teachers and learners. The other one is for research purposes, because there's a lot of sensitive IP that's associated there. And then the third pillar is around, for the rest of the institution, right? Like, me, right? And all staff within the institution. So like some of the common guardrails that we have as part of the acceptable use policy is, I know I mentioned human in the loop. I'll continue to harp on that. Absolutely have a human in the loop with respect to any decisioning. That's one. But then some of the first, I guess it's important to start with first principles, right? One of the first things that we're really embarking on is literacy, right? Like AI literacy. Like what are these, how do you use these Gen AI tools? What are the benefits, but what are also the risks and challenges, right? Like unless you appreciate and understand that, I mean, people won't be really going or adopting AI. So we're really focusing a lot of effort on AI literacy. The second one is around being very focused on the use cases you want to solve for, right? Because we may not need a 500 billion parameter LLM, right? Like we can do with 2 billion. I mean, I'm just making it up, but then you really need to hone in on the use cases you want to solve for, and then use that to kind of, inform what your guardrails are. And the other thing that comes to mind is that absolutely don't put any confidential or sensitive data, right? Like in your user prompts. Again, like this is my wish list. It would be wonderful when the LLMs or any connectors can actually come up with a warning or banner saying, hey, Priya, like for example, you're about to enter something sensitive. Are you sure about that? Or better still, have a DLP that absolutely, disallows it. I know we're not there yet, but then those are some of the things that we're keeping in mind as we're putting together the acceptable use policy.
That's great. Hashim, your thoughts?
So here are a few things, and Priya, I think we are there on the data side. So I think literacy is going to be there for sure. I think educating people internally of what LLM or AI tools are acceptable. The other side of it is from a security standpoint or a risk standpoint, when we look at it, it's the governance, privacy, security team needs to kind of sit together and say, okay, what are we going to allow? What kind of people are going to be allowed to use these tools, and what is the output of it? Like, what is the use case that we're driving these people to use it? So we kind of look at it from that perspective and say, okay, IT teams will have access to X amount of capabilities in Copilot, for example, and executives will have X kind of controls and access, right? So you can kind of have to work through that process. So I think there has to be some kind of a committee or some kind of function that owns the AI tool. I think Ontario government did a good job recently of Bill 194, where they've kind of put a compliance framework. It's not there yet, but I think that's pretty good for most organizations to now say, well, we have a Bill 194, what is the regulation around it? Let's tie it back into it. So I think that's really good when we look at from a overall perspective of building a framework of AI inside an organization. And the last thing I generally harp on my customers is just saying, protect the data that goes in, understand what data is coming out, who's access to it. So DLP is what we use. We coach our users. So we have kind of built a model where you can say, we have ChatGPT, and you have a corporate version of ChatGPT, and then you have your personal instance of ChatGPT. And I think from me personally to my kids, they all use ChatGPT now. So the idea is, if we're using a corporate ChatGPT model, then that corporate data should live within that ChatGPT model. So what Netscope's been able to do is in real time differentiate at the user level and say, hey, you're using corporate ChatGPT, you can put this data in. But if you're using your personal and you decided to put a PHI data into it, the DLP engine would pop up and say, hey, you're putting confidential data into that. So that's where we are trying to get to the user and coach the user in real time, and then also understand what kind of AI tools they're using. So the literacy part of it ties into it, the coaching ties into it, and then the visibility ties into it to the business. That, hey, these people in your organizations are using these AI applications. There's a good reason you might want to investigate into it or put policy around it. Like Grammarly is a big one right now. Everybody's using Grammarly. It's all good, but end of the day, it's still an AI tool and it's acceptable, but it has its back-end regulations that people don't read, right? So
yeah, and now we have the DeepSec, which has been like in the news and currently like the hot topic. So Carlos, your thoughts around safeguarding the AI models?
Yeah, okay, so mine's going to be a little bit simpler because I would say if you're writing it down, it's 3 columns: people, process, and technology, right? And we all know PPT. And come to IVO and CDW for people and process. They can help you. But when we're talking about the technology, they can help you with technology as well. But when we're talking about technology, then you're thinking, what are my frameworks around people? What are my frameworks around process, which kind of been talked about? And then what are my frameworks around the technology, right? Best practices. So you want to secure the endpoint, right? The servers, the workloads, wherever these RAG data stores are in the cloud or your servers. What's the best practice for protecting that? Then identity. How do we protect who has access to it? Identity. And then data protection, the data that is stored in there. How do we protect the actual data in the database? Is there sensitive data in there? Well, should we be pulling that out? Do users have control over their own sensitive data, or do we enforce access to sensitive data? And then the last piece I would share is, you can't protect what you can't see. So visibility matters, right? So you need to be able to, and I don't want to use technology terms, but where do I bring all my logs into, hint, hint, so that I can see what's happening within my AI stores, my models, but across my organization as well, right? How do I pull all that data and get visibility and then correlate that across? I'm kind of hinting, logs, correlations, right? You want to be able to pull all that into a SIM. And that is the best practice as well for that. So people, process, technology, you want to go across protecting the workloads, identity, data protection, and visibility.
Perfect. I think that I'm going to take a lead from you, and I'm going to get a little more technical, so then hopefully we can make everybody happy here. But I think that when we look at the current large language models or RAG architectures that we're seeing at clients and clients are deploying, they're starting from what are my controls that are native, right? That's always the question you want to ask first. What's the stuff that came along with it that I can just turn on? So most of the major ones actually have pretty good policy controls. They have pretty good filtering controls that you can start from there. So start with the native security, and then obviously then we start thinking, okay, now we need to make sure that the data is clean and the data is right. We already touched on that. So there are e-discovery tools out there that can be used for that specifically, but also when we're talking about the access and, not to touch on agentic AI, which is not part of our conversation here, identity is going to be such a big play in it. And we've kind of been touching on it. And identity and access management is a tough thing to solve externally. Externally super easy, internally super tough. Organizations have really a lot of challenge around identity and access management. So that you don't need to fully untangle that thing before you move into these things, but it's a high recommendation. And then when we come to monitoring, we touched on SIM. I think step one is get those use cases further up the chain. Don't expect to just have a big red panel at the end because you put all potential use cases from injection perspective in there. We are seeing people, bring the SIM back kind of idea where they're connecting their models right and sending those prompts straight into the SIM. Well, now you're back to sort of the problem we had 10 years ago, which is too much noise, right? So if you tune in the beginning, if you identify how it's going to be used, and you put some good guardrails in the end, then you can starting to go back to using the SIM for that investigation. And a quick small note I want to make about mental health here. I think it's really important when we are testing these systems, when we have red teams testing these systems, they are psychologically engaged, right? And that can be really tough on people. And then we have to, we talk about bias, we talk about fairness. I think it's really important to make sure that the people who are using these systems are well cared for, and we're keeping track of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Because this isn't just a remote code execution or finding a vulnerability. These are philosophical or maybe psychological things that they're playing with as well. So it's really important to balance that out and understand.
Yeah, those are some excellent and fantastic points. So yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So as we kind of go into the final minutes of this discussions, maybe I think it's good to take a couple of questions from the audience, though I have been warned by panel not to specifically ask questions from the audience, but okay. So maybe if we can have a couple of questions. Yes, please.
So my name is Ankur Bajaj, and so my question is, I just want to know your thoughts around the ethics and psychology of these AI models, right? Think of it from a perspective, a typical trolley problem, right? Mm-hmm. Will you pull that lever or not? If that question is asked to an AI, what that AI's thoughts would be, how it would be swayed, and what are the guardrails that we can put around it?
I'm going to send that to the academic folks, I think.
Oh, me? Oh, okay, well. Okay, yeah. So if I were to rephrase your question, so it's around, the ethical, the guardrails that you put around it. Yeah, it's interesting in the sense that, like I said, right? Like we are in the process of, putting together the AI framework. Some of the fairness and responsible use of AI is around, I will say, making sure that you're asking. How do I put this? So in terms of the user prompts, right, that you're entering into LLMs, of course, right now we are not there yet where we can apply content moderation. So it's around really educating the end user in terms of, being very mindful and discretionary in terms of, the user prompts that they use for these LLMs. Because guess what? Like, as you enter your user prompts and queries, it's going to use it to train to train the models as well. So that's one thing that comes to mind. But then actually, I'm going to talk about a use case that relates to exactly this. I know I was talking about the AI detection tools earlier, but then another use case that we're looking at exploring is, looking at mock interview solutions, like Gen AI mock interview solutions. So there are these solutions out there where you literally, I mean, you have a digital avatar, right? Like kind of interviewing you, asking you the questions, and then at the end of it, I mean, of course, the avatar kind of, asks you the questions, looks at you, looks at your body language, looks at, how you respond to the questions, and at the end, gives you kind of an evaluation summary, right? So it is pretty cool. I think one of the vendors out there is InStage, but then there's other VidRecord. There's a few other tools out there as well. But one of the things that comes to mind is exactly this, right? Like how are you making sure that you're having unbiased outputs, right? Because you need to account for the fact that English may not be everyone's first language. That's one. Another thing that comes to mind is that, different individuals may have different ways of focusing and articulating your thoughts. So, just because you have your grammar wrong, or just because, let's say, you're focusing with your eyes closed, like, is it going to score you negatively? So again, I mean, I know I'm not answering your question directly, but then there's a few interesting use cases that come in mind, which is why this is a new technology for all of us, right? I mean, AI has been around for 60 years. It's a Gen AI component I'm specifically referring to. So it's very important to be agile and learn as we go. We are all learning together. So I guess like as and when we learn about how these models and how these Gen AI tools work, we need to be agile and adaptable as well. Which is why right now we do have a draft AI framework. But then we do understand it's a living and breathing document, right? As and when we see more risks surface, we want to make sure we accordingly account for that. Hope that helps. Yeah.
AI pull the lever.
Yeah, to answer your question directly, no.
No.
This was actually the part of the discussion that like the whole semester was dedicated to this point topic only.
Yeah.
During my masters, and we were not able to come to a conclusion whether you give that kind of control to AI or not.
That's the thing, human in the loop, right? Yeah, always. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was thanks for the questions, and thanks Priya for the excellent elaboration, explanation. So as we kind of like wrap up this discussion, again, like some excellent insights into how exactly, like what do we understand by retrieval augmented generations? What are some of the security risks pertaining to the implementation of RAG architecture and the best practices, as well as some final thoughts and takeaways here. So I do appreciate everyone's time here and the excellent insights which have been contributed by the panel members. So thank you once again for joining us, and have a great afternoon. So thank you.